middle camera, left camera, and then when he starts, we talk as if we're just in our living room.
Okay.
Sure. Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with Chabad House of Delmar, together with my co-host Mark Ronich of Statewide News Service and jbiztechvalley.com. We have a very, very special guest with us, Professor Barry Trachtenberg. Barry, you're the University of UAlbany Associate Professor of History, European History specifically, and also the Director of Jewish Programming, Judaic Studies.
Yep.
Well, welcome. Can I call you Barry?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
You know what? I just tell you something personally.
Yeah.
If my druthers, I would take European history. I would just be the major. Of course, I'm a rabbi, but I just love history, and I could listen to a history lecture the whole day. But you know, let's talk about, of course, the Jewish View.
Yeah.
So we have to talk about some Jewish history. Teach many courses on the Holocaust, and I mean, there's so many things that we can go to, like I say, for hours. But just in general, are the students interested, or maybe even non-Jewish students? You know, it's interesting. I went to Holocaust Museum, Washington, D.C., and there's people, you know, you just wait in line, and there's people from Oklahoma. So I was just intrigued. Why would someone, there's Washington, D.C., you can see anything and stay there for a week, and why would they want to go to the Holocaust Museum? So, you know, I asked them, says, you know, I know you're not Jewish, why would you want to come here? He says, well, you know, it's interesting. They didn't give us such a good answer, but really, it comes out many times. Maybe you know more than I do about the statistics. Most people don't even know about the Holocaust if you would go out there. So, you know, in America, maybe in the world.
I think that's not necessarily the case anymore, to tell you the truth. I think the Holocaust has become so much of the fabric of American society in ways that no one would have imagined in the decades after World War II. All of my students come to my classes with some Holocaust education. It's mandatory in New York State, I think in the 10th grade.
Really?
I think it's more than 30 states as part of the public school curriculum. In most major cities.
What's the percentage of Jews, just to interrupt on
I don't poll them, but my guess
is
it's probably around 50-50.
Really?
Yeah.
50% are interested in Holocaust studies. Yeah. That's interesting, that's what I'm saying.
50% of my classes, I assume, are Jewish. 50% about not.
Give or take, but that's a lot. I mean, it's not you think, Holocaust studies, all the Jews go there, but it's interesting.
Not necessarily. I mean, many are interested in World War II. Many of them also feel like there's a moral imperative to some level. It's something that they should know. It's something they're intrigued about. They want to understand about hatred. They want to understand about genocide. They want to understand about anti-Semitism. And they feel, taking the classes is the way to go, which certainly I would agree.
And it's not an easy 3-credit course.
It's not an easy 3-credit course. It's not an easy because we have high standards, and it's also not easy because it's tough material.
Right.
And the real challenge is getting them to think beyond the education that they get from the popular media, where they think it's all about Schindler or it's all about evil sort of Nazis as masterminds, from television and movies, and we have to sort of humanize it for them and get them to see that it's not a supernatural event, but it's something that was done by people to people.
I have an interesting, another clip of a story. There is a Holocaust exhibit in our state museum, which is downtown Albany, and I saw one of my sons, who was actually very bright, but he was a very young person, and he was just always, like you say, almost like there's evil in the world. And he saw, they have, of course, a picture of Adolf Hitler. And he says, yeah, remember the innocent kid, a Jewish kid? He says, doesn't look so mean. He's just standing there. Yeah. So, I'm saying that, like, oh, they're so evil and they're so mean, which they did mean acts. Yeah. But the German people, there are people like any other people. And
absolutely, absolutely. And one of the myths or misperceptions that my students often come to class with is that the German people from the very beginning were just fully anti-Semitic and just embraced Hitler from the beginning. And I have to remind them that the Nazis were in power for 12 years. And it took 6 years of them being in power in order to come to a situation where Jews could be fully marginalized. The German people had to be trained, they had to be incentivized to sign up with the Nazi regime and its plan for the genocide of Jews and others. That they didn't come to Nazism at the outset. They had to really be trained and encouraged and cajoled in all sorts of ways to reach these conclusions about Jews.
Yeah, I consider
Yeah.
that one of the more important lessons also, because you can be taken off, that, it's just like you have to be real evil to be in the Holocaust. I mean, I know there's books, I'm telling you, you're the professor, but that, what's it called, the 101, or the SS troops.
Oh,
And they were interviewing them, like, how
yeah, the
bad
members
are they?
of that police battalion 101,
Yeah,
yeah, the
that's it.
Einsatzgruppen.
I know
Yeah.
one person that came to my house, he actually immigrated at 10 years old and got out of Vienna. So then by the time he was in the army, he was in, like after World War II, and he went to Germany because we still have United States troops in Germany.
Yeah.
So he went to a PX, a bar, and the guy who's serving him was a former SS. And this guy's a Jewish guy, so he kind of like a fast interview. He says, "Why did you do it?" And the guy says, "I needed a job."
Yeah.
So you think an SS guy, they took the meanest, the worst people. The guy needed a job, so he
Yeah,
took
but
the
there are
job.
moral issues with what type of job do you take. You just don't take a job just for the sake of it.
Yeah.
Do you take a job because you believe in something? Or do you just...
And
I
that's
just
what he's
can't-
saying now is his reasons for being in it. We don't
Yeah,
know
you're right.
what he would have said in, 39, 41.
You know, I wanted to... I was looking over all the articles, and you're very... this publish or perish thing, you don't have a problem with publishing, I can see that.
Well,
As a
it's
professor.
work. It's a lot of work.
But a lot of what you focused on was a community in Orange County called Kiryas Joel.
Yeah.
Tell me about what you found out about Kiryas Joel, and I think in one of the pieces investigating Kiryas Joel, my friend Chris McKenna
Yeah.
did a piece with
He and I spoke together
and,
at the JCC about that a couple of
and
years
he
ago.
used to work for the New York Post, and
Yeah, and
now he's
at the
working with the
Times Herald
Senate
Record, right?
and the Times Herald Record
Yep.
before that,
Mhm.
but now he's with the Senate Republicans.
Yep.
So that's my, and his wife was on the Albany School Board,
Ah,
Holly
interesting.
McKenna. But tell me what you found out about this.
Well,
about
my
Kiryas
role
Joel.
with Kiryas Joel, which is actually how they call it, Kiryas Joel, believe it or not, KJ,
Okay. KJ.
was I started off being interested in it because I was asked to do so and to be a researcher while I was still a graduate student at UCLA. My advisor, David Myers, who's a professor of history, and his wife, Nomi Stolzenberg, who's a law professor at USC, began getting very interested in it. And so they sent me out for sort of a 2-week kind of anthropological mission. This is back in 2000. And so I stayed at a hotel nearby and just went into the community on a regular basis, talked to people, anyone who would talk to me, took photos, gathered up as much material. There was a weekly newspaper at the time, the KJ Bulletin, I think it was called, and then there's the Satmar newspaper, Der Yid, as well. And so I was gathering these materials, and then I got a job here in Albany, and so my interest just continued, for many, many years. And it's an absolutely fascinating community.
Tell us about
it's
it.
1.1 square mile, and it's now home to about 25,000 people. So it's the most densely populated area in New York State outside of New York City. It's close to 100% Satmar Hasidim. It's a Yiddish-speaking community, and it's unlike any other place I've seen.
I just
Yeah,
want to...
it's also the poorest community in the country.
It's legally the poorest in the country. 100% of the students who are in the schools receive food assistance.
Right.
Many of them receive, financial aid.
And many of the residents, the parents, are on welfare.
Yeah, I think a very, very high number are. as well.
Like
Yeah.
80% or something. It's huge. It's
Yep.
a high number.
Mhm.
I mean, what did you come across that in your studies? Did you talk about that in your
Well,
studies?
what's interesting, so I was a researcher. I haven't written very much on Kiryas Joel, actually. My old advisor still, he's about to come out with a book, I think, in the next year or two on it.
Okay. Stay tuned, as
Stay
Rabbi
tuned.
Simon would
Yeah,
say.
exactly. And, it's a community that has learned very, very well how to make use of the social welfare system that is available, which was meant to serve individuals, but they figured out how to use it on a collective basis, I think, for the good of the community. So there's that which sustains the community, but the other piece that sustains the community is just the social service network that is traditional to Jewish communities for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that they have a very high level of charity, a very high level of community cooperation. And so the public services there are wonderful. It's a tiny village. There's a massive fire station. There is a whole birthing center for women having children with a spa in the basement. There's all sorts of ambulance corps and security groups that are there for the community, very much of it with public funds. And this is, of course, very controversial, and the neighbors aren't all very happy about this.
Right.
But they've been very, very effective at leveraging their political clout for the good of the community.
And legally, we've got to mention. For the most part.
I think mostly for the most part legally, although there have been occasions when that's been called into question.
I just wanted to footnote interject before that. Why would people, just for our viewers, why would they want to be contained if it's so dense? It's not like New York City around Kiryas Joel, so there's enough land to say the least.
Well, aren't they moving out to Woodbury a little bit?
Well, in part, but the attraction for Kiryas Joel initially goes back to the 1970s when the Satmar Hasidim, who were based in Williamsburg, would come up to the Catskills, come to upstate New York for summer times and have camps and to get out of the city, and increasingly realized this would be a place where they could live according to their values and their traditions in a way where they could perhaps keep out those aspects of the modern world that they didn't want to have. So sort of the official sort of line is that people don't have TVs, they don't have internet, they don't listen to the radio unless it is permitted. The reality is you can go on Yiddish language chat rooms, that are on Israeli servers, which is fascinating, and learn all about, the day-to-day life, and you kind of get a glimpse into the inside world there. And what you realize is actually a very fractured community that has many, many internal divisions, and there's lots of battles for control over both the legacy of the Satmar community as a whole, which has two major divisions, but also then control over the village.
Again, Mark, I was just trying to explain to our viewers that Orthodox Jews do not drive on the Sabbath. So therefore, like you say, 1 square mile, you really could take the center synagogue in the center, like you said, Rebbe, and draw a radius of 1 mile and then just draw around the big circle, and that's where everybody would be. And that's why they're more condensed, which leads to problems in a certain sense, because then the real estate values go up.
Exactly.
People say, oh, you go here for a few miles, you go drive there for a few miles, then everybody's spread out. So that's what happens in Williamsburg, that everybody's so condensed and concentrated, and then they feel, well, we need another point, where to be, and that's what you're saying, that they want to look even for another place.
Right, and they are looking at either Monroe or Woodbury.
Yeah, absolutely.
Expand,
I mean,
right?
the birth rate is really quite high. It's 8, 10 children sometimes in a family, and it's really quite fascinating to me the first time I was there, and you would see a group of children playing in the yard, and you think, oh, that's like when I was a kid, all the neighborhood kids, and you realize,
it's one family.
It's the same family, and I mean, that's their way, So,
right.
And what's interesting, and the project of some of our research is, what are sort of the limits of a democratic society which is founded on the basis of individual rights and individual responsibilities, to accommodate communities that are formed on a collective basis that work for the good of the group as opposed to the individual.
Now,
and looking at the relations and how does that play out in questions of law, how does it play out in questions of communal relations and so on.
Now, I also noticed that you write about the language, the Yiddish language.
Yeah, that's my primary field, actually. Yeah.
And whether it's a dying language, whether it's resurgence.
Yeah, I don't write on that, but
okay.
Yeah.
You grew up speaking Yiddish, though?
No, I grew up English. I learned Yiddish at university, and one of the things I actually do with my work is to try to move away from sort of biological definitions of Yiddish and encourage my students to think about languages that
Yiddish, the ever-dying language, reflection on the modern language movement.
Yeah, so that was an essay that I was
so
questioning. Sorry.
Okay.
But that was a talk that was questioning this notion of Yiddish has always been talked of since really it began this process where people tried to modernize the language, that it was always on the cusp of dying. And so I was talking about where did this notion of Yiddish as always dying come? Because they were the very first enthusiasts and advocates for Yiddish did so because they said Yiddish is dying, and this was 120 years ago now, and it's not dead yet. And so
you live to be 120, so maybe it's coming.
Yeah. On the other hand, you connect the two things together.
Yes.
I mean, how maybe the demographics, how, as I see that, the religious or the Hasidic community, for example, and there's Kiryas Joel, they're all speaking Yiddish, the Jewish language, and it's say, again, for our viewers may not know, that it's a dialect from, it's mainly German, that's Yiddishized, but there's a lot of smattering of Russian, Polish, and now even
English.
English, now that we're in English. But it's particular to the Jewish people, and it was like the home language. That's what. But what happened when in America 100 years ago, people would just say, "Speak English," be a good American. So what? Tell me if I'm wrong. What you have is the religious, like maybe insular community speaking the Yiddish because they're still very Jewish-minded, and your regular American kid in the street really knows about a mention, maybe a few say dirty words or something like that. So it's really the Yiddish is alive and well, yes, but in the religious community.
Yeah, and in some ways, what Kiryas Joel represents is almost the return of the historic functions of the Yiddish language, which was a way to maintain cohesion of a community, but also to erect borders and boundaries between that community and the rest of the world. And so what you find for the residents of Kiryas Joel is that the women are at least bilingual with Yiddish and English, and the men, of course, are at least trilingual with Hebrew, Yiddish, and English, right? So they have languages that are within the community and languages outside of the community. Interestingly, though, when children go off to school at age 5, almost all of them have to take ESL. Although they're born and raised in New York State, they're speaking Yiddish entirely at home. They're playing with with one another in the Yiddish language, and then they need to learn English when they go off to school.
But I can connect all three ideas that we talk about all together. Because it's not the Chabad, we're a different movement than the Satmar movement and Kiryas Joel, but still I know where they're coming from a little bit. And for number one, you say insular because it is from the Holocaust, because what we were just talking about, you had normal people, and they're really more, Satmar really was centered in Hungary, not Germany, but the Holocaust reached entire Europe. In any case, and, here they're good neighbors, and all of a sudden, good government, you're being a decent person, and they turn against you. Hey, we're going to kill you. What did I do? I'm a decent person, living for hundreds of years, my family here. So now all of a sudden they're burned. They don't, you say, well, wouldn't have it. It's the United States, come on. But, don't tell them that because it's, hey, Hungary was a nice place too, and you never know what's going to happen. And then number two, like I said, the assimilation is so incredible amongst the Jewish people. The Pew study just came out, 50% of American Jewry is intermarried. So there is what to be concerned. If you want, hey, I want my kids to be Jewish, and, so saying, well, take away the iPad, take away all this internet, like you're saying, and just let's try to be insular.
So we have apps in Yiddish now. So
That's
No,
there's enough
of that.
there is. Yeah.
Well, I'm just saying, obviously that's, Chabad is known for that. Our internet, Chabad.org, tens of thousands of, so we're working with the world. That's, like I say, I'm not saying that's the right way because we have our own way of doing things, but
it's
just to
understandable.
legitimize,
Sure.
Justify their reactions, which again, I don't agree. Chabad is always open. I'm in Delmar. How many religious Jews are there? I'm there to work with the community, not to insulate my family from them, but again, just to understand them fuller.
Yeah, and Kiryas Joel isn't the only community of its kind in New York State. You also have, for example, the Skver Hasidim, who are in New Square, New York, which is a very similar kind of community. It's much smaller. Rockland County, yeah. And, they too have sought to maintain their ways and their values in the United States, in New York State. And there's something interesting about New York in some ways, that it allows for the possibility of these different groups coming in, because it's not just them, it's also, you have groups like the Bruderhof, for example, who are down in Woodstock and now, have a pretty strong presence here in Albany, New York as well. It's an Anabaptist group, like, the Mennonites, but like the Satmars, they came to the United States in the 1930s in order to escape Nazi persecution, moved to upstate New York, and they have their own communities.
But they're not Jewish.
They're not Jews. No, they're Anabaptists, yeah. So I'm saying it's an interesting phenomenon about New York State in particular that allows for the creation of these societies that can be both a part of the larger state.
Because it was such an immigrant, New York City was such an immigrant
and there's
haven.
available land and a notion of tolerance for diversity and pluralism.
I'm curious about something else. How do you interact with Shabbos House and Hillel and other Jewish groups, Chapel House on
The
campus?
Judaic Studies program?
The Judaic Studies program.
We,
You know, I mean,
yeah.
I don't know how all that confluence, I'm just asking out
Yeah,
of
so
curiosity.
officially they're separate organizations, right?
Absolutely.
We have a pretty strong relationship with Hillel on campus. You know, so the Hillel rabbi, Nomi Manon, teaches a class with us, and we co-sponsor activities with one another.
And is it
almost-
still, is it called JSC, Jewish Students Coalition Hillel, JSC Hillel, or just
I
Hillel?
think it's just
Because
Hillel.
when I went to college at University of Albany, it was JSC Hillel. And it was
I
just-
think it's
okay,
just Hillel now.
Hillel.
I think it's just
Okay.
Hillel. And almost a very, very high number of our students are active with Shabbos House.
Right.
And so our students go really from one to the other to the other. You know,
Because I think Shabbos
yeah.
House and Hill work very much
they work
together
they
hand
do
in
lots
hand.
of programming together. I think they alternate Shabbos,
Yeah.
Can I ask-
dinners.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you go personally to?
I don't.
No,
I don't.
okay.
Yeah.
And do you belong to a
I
congregation?
don't.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay, you're just unaffiliated.
Well, yeah. I teach it, breathe it, live it.
That's
but
it.
yeah. Yeah.
And what about, did you take a sabbatical for a year, or?
I did take a sabbatical for a year.
Okay, and what'd you
Yeah.
do on your sabbatical? Anything interesting?
I'm working on 2 book projects
Okay,
kind of
tell us about it.
simultaneously.
Give us a little bit
Sure.
of a teaser over here.
Yeah, well, the one I'm really working on right now is not my long-term one. It's more of a short-term project. It's actually on the U.S. and the Holocaust, what we were talking about a little bit earlier. And this is a project that will result in a book, hopefully to come out in 2016 if I meet my deadlines, that is meant to be a teaching tool for classes on this particular subject. So it's meant for upper-level undergraduates.
Judaic programming, you mean?
Well, not necessarily, just be classes on the
History.
Holocaust, history courses.
All right.
And what I'm trying to do a little differently is to really bring in a Jewish perspective into that. So I'm going through back issues of the Yiddish Vorwärts, for example. I'm looking through the Jewish press, looking at what Yiddish writers, Yiddish poets are saying about this. I'm trying to bring that perspective into it and not just make it a question of foreign policy. So that's one project. But my real sort of heart and soul is in a long-term book project that I'm working on, the Yiddish Encyclopedia,
Really,
which
that's a
was,
big major.
this was it's called the Allgemeine Encyclopedia, so the General Encyclopedia, and it was founded in 1930 in Berlin by Eastern European Jews who were exiles from Bolshevism, and they thought that the 9 or 10 million Jews who were Yiddish speakers around the world needed an encyclopedia, like the Britannica, you know, which would tell them about the news of the world, and that would bring them up to date. Or they looked to the French Larousse or the Brockhaus and Ephron in Germany, and says, you know, this is what Jews need. And so there's a lot of debates, like, should this be a Jewish encyclopedia? Should it be an encyclopedia in Yiddish? And finally, they agreed to the 70-30 split. That would be 70% general knowledge, and then 30% on particular Jewish topics.
Who did you agree on this with? I mean, yourself?
Oh,
Did
I
you-
didn't agree
no,
on this.
You said,
no, I mean, this
we
is what.
agreed, so.
No, they agreed.
They who?
The scholars involved in this project, these
Oh,
exiles
I
from
just-
from Bolshevism who were living
Oh,
in Germany in
this is
1930.
1930s,
It's 1930. It's not my encyclopedia. I'm writing a
Okay.
history of it.
You're writing
Sorry.
the history of it.
Of this encyclopedia
And the word
project.
Allgemeine?
Allgemeine means general.
General.
So it's the General Encyclopedia.
Okay.
So they found this project in 1930.
They never finished it.
Well, it's an interesting
that-
question.
Yeah.
They put out a sample volume in 1932 that goes through the entire Aleph base, the entire alphabet, so you can get a little sample of each letter. Then, of course, 33 happens, Hitler comes to power, and they have to flee. And the organizers mostly go to Paris, which was the home of the exiled, sort of left Yiddish-speaking Jewish intelligentsia during the Nazi period. And they continue to publish this encyclopedia. They put out volume 34, 35, 36. But increasingly, the general thrust of the project gives way to more Jewish content. So at the end of the 1936 volume, there's a long essay on anti-Semitism, which is entirely out of place with the rest of the volume. But clearly the anti-Semitism that's growing in the 30s begins to dominate their thinking. 1937, they put out another volume, the last essay, Eretz Yisrael, Land of Israel. These are people who are not Zionists. And yet they're really starting to rethink their whole relationship
11 years before.
to the project.
of
Well,
Yeah.
or it's 2 years before
For-
the real Holocaust.
before the
was
war
right.
begins, right? And so then they put out nothing in 38, and then in 39, they put out the supplement volume on Jews called Yidden that they were going to put out only when the project was completed. But they say the worsening situation forces us to put it out now. And then the war begins soon after they put it out. So their entire audience is almost lost to them. In March of 40, still safe in Paris, they put out another volume, which they shipped to America, which gets sunk by a U-boat. Mm-hmm. A few volumes survive because they were sent through the regular mail, and they get picked up by the Central Yiddish Cultural Organization in New York. But of course, in May of 40, they're invaded again. Mm-hmm. So they flee through Spain, make their way to Portugal, those who can. Some die en route. And they end up in New York, and they continue publishing this encyclopedia until 1966.
Really?
But during the war and after the war, they only publish volumes on the topic of Jews. So they end up putting out 12 volumes in Yiddish. 5 of them are on the Aleph base. They only make it partway through the second letter of the alphabet. Oh. They end at Balei Chaim, at animals. And then they put out 7 volumes on the topic of Jews. And so what you see through this process is sort of the death of the Yiddish-speaking community in large numbers, the shifts in the sort of the imperatives, the ideological and educational imperatives of Jewish intellectuals, and then their hopes and visions for the Jewish future, because one of the last volumes opens with a picture of the Statue of Liberty. And they realize that this encyclopedia can be a vessel to help the new immigrants who are coming to the U.S., the Yiddish speakers, make their way into the Americas. And then the final 2 volumes are some of the first comprehensive studies of the Holocaust, wow, done by people with the most intimate knowledge of it. And what's terribly sad is, at the opening address of this, it was done by the Simon Dubnov, who was the great historian of the Eastern European Jews. He talked about this project for the millions of Jews who could read it. And then the very last edition that comes out in 1966, in the foreword it says, we hope that this volume will reach the thousands of people who are available. And the truth is, most of those volumes never sold. They're still in a basement in New York.
I never even heard about.
Do you have a volume?
I have 2 full sets, actually, including one of the volumes that were sunk, but the ones that went through the mail. Yeah, that's
wow,
my most precious.
That's incredible.
Object.
So what's your book going to be about?
It's going to be a history of this entire encyclopedia project.
And do you have a working title for the book?
I do. It's called Bible for a New Age.
Oh.
Because that is how they spoke about it at that opening address. Simon Dubnov said, just like Moses Mendelssohn, who translated the Bible from Hebrew into German, said, so too will we create a Bible for a new age. And so think about the implications of this, that secular knowledge is somehow going to be equivalent to sacred knowledge in terms of what the needs of the Jewish communities are.
Would you ever continue to think about continuing the encyclopedia, or is this a massive job?
That is not for me to do, but there is a Yiddish language Wikipedia, they call it. There's a Yiddish language Wikipedia page in which they're using the original volumes as a starting point to add on. Because we live in an age now where no one buys encyclopedias, right? We just go to Wikipedia, we go to other sources. And so there's actually one in the Yiddish language now.
There's a website, Vin or something, I forgot what it is, but they were at Kosher Fest last November, and they put a video of Kosher Fest up, so I linked it to my website, and we did 3 shows on Kosher Fest, so I added that as a 4th one, and but it's they're out there. The people very active who are the Yiddish speakers, and they have their own little culture, and they do their own, and I could understand Yiddish more than speak it.
Me too.
So I just have a great affinity. In my house, my mother and grandmother spoke Yiddish.
That's all right.
But they try to speak Yiddish so I wouldn't understand, and then I picked up on it, and I did understand. And
you teach Yiddish at the university?
I don't teach Yiddish language. I sometimes teach translated works. And I did actually a freshman seminar last fall on Yiddish, where I introduced students to the history of the language.
People were
University
interested.
How many professors are there at the University of Albany, Judaic Studies?
I'm it, unfortunately.
Well, you have Nomi Manon.
Oh, sure, but as full-time faculty, it's just
well,
myself.
How many other?
We have other
Brenner?
people who teach for us. Artie Brenner teaches 4 classes a year for us, who's terrific. Don Cashman teaches a class for us every year. And then we have other faculty members who will teach courses from time to time. In addition, we have Sarit Moskowitz, who teaches Hebrew for us on a full-time basis. Martha Rosette teaches a class on Jewish American literature and so on.
What's the difference? I mean, these are teachers, but they're not professors. They don't get health benefits or what? I don't know what the difference
Well, it depends. If now I'm putting on my union hat for a second here. If you teach one class, you're in the union. If you teach two classes, you're eligible for all the benefits of the union. So you can get health care and things like that.
I see.
If you teach, I think, two classes in an academic year.
Well, if you need anyone to talk about Jews and journalism, I'll teach that.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, we're out of time. Listen, Professor, I could talk to you all day, literally, because I love history and surely Jewish history. But it was very nice. We'll just have to ask you again another time to come back. Thank you very much. You continue with your good work that you're doing in Jewish life and with good health.
Great. Thank you so much.